All right, well,
Oh,
I
Kyle.
guess we could get, oh, thank you, yeah. So some of you may not know me. My name's Kyle Marlantes. I'm a PhD student here, third year under Professor Mackey. And I was originally supposed to give this talk in like winter of 2020. So it's a little bit delayed, but I'm excited to give it. So we'll get started. That is me on top of Mount Baker in Washington State. There'll be more mountaineering photos. We'll get to them as we go. So I was born in Western Washington. I grew up basically in three places in Western Washington. So just south of Seattle in Des Moines, Washington. And then also my family for like multiple generations has had a place out on the coast. It's very basic, but we go out there all the time in the summertime. So I spent a lot of time out there as a kid. There's a photo of us out on the beach. And then when I was right before I started sixth grade, my parents literally bought a farm out in Southwest Washington, and we moved there. So the second half of my childhood was very rural. So there's a couple photos of me and my my two brothers. I'm the middle child, so I have an older and a younger brother. And that's, I think, at Thanksgiving. So that's actually a pretty good timing for that photo. So when I was young, my dad, he was a scientific photographer for Boeing. And that's kind of an unusual position. But what that means is he was involved with all of the wind tunnel testing at the transonic wind tunnel at Boeing Field. And so growing up, you know, if I went to like take your child to work day, which I did, we would go to the Everett plant where they're building 777s, or we'd go to the transonic wind tunnel. I even got to go to NASA Ames as a kid. And I got to see some testing occur down at Ames, which was super cool. And there's a photo of me and my older brother at the 747 with the shuttle on top. So that was like, I mean, I don't remember that, but you know, that's the kind of thing as I was growing up, like we were exposed to. So yeah, this is the wind tunnel building at Boeing Field in Seattle. And I would see, like as a pretty young kid, I would see like flow viz. Like my dad would be like, check out this flow viz on the whatever wing of whatever plane. And so it was really cool to be exposed to that. So I would assume that's where I got an interest in fluids, got an interest in engineering. But also as a kid, I was like very industrious. So I had some early naval architecture experiences and some early aeronautical engineering experiences. So this photo right here is of a skin-on-frame kayak I built when I was 8 years old. And I was down at the beach out on the coast, and I saw some people kayaking. And I'm 8 years old, and I remember this vividly, and I'm like, that looks awesome. I want to be in a small boat. So I go home with my family, and I asked my parents, I think for that like Christmas that year, I was like, I want a kayak. I want a sea kayak, but I'm 8 years old. So, you know, that's a lot to ask for. I didn't get a sea kayak. And so I thought, well, what am I going to do? Because I really want a kayak. So I thought, well, I'll build one. So we were taking down a picket fence in the backyard. And so I salvaged some of the pickets and I built this in the backyard with a tarp. And here's a photo of me actually paddling around in it at 8 years old. And this started a chain of interest in building and designing small boats, which we'll get to. But there's a couple other photos. We were building like a log raft on the beach, a Lego ship, and that's some sort of airplane. I guess I was interested in like swept wings, you know, like thinking about maybe, you know, supersonic flight or something. I don't know. But right around the time when I got into sixth grade, my parents bought a farm, and we transitioned from living in Seattle to basically living in a rural area. And so here's me on a tractor. I don't know how old I was, probably 10 maybe, mowing a field. And I started building more boats. So there's another boat in the lower left there. I was getting into sailing rigs, I guess. And this is my first consulting job. So my younger brother wanted to build a boat because I was building boats. So I helped him build that boat. And that had a really like advanced, like curved bow design. So we were experimenting with hydrodynamics there. And I also built a little cabin, which I built that in my 6th grade and 7th grade year. And I actually like salvaged rocks, like collected rocks and built a masonry foundation for it. So you can imagine like this elementary school kid out there, like trying to learn how to do masonry, but it's still standing. It's still at my parents' place. It's like they made it very quaint now. So, and there was more farm life. So in high school, I was getting more ambitious with my boat building. So I designed and built this 12-foot sailing catamaran, which I never launched. So I don't know if it ever worked. And I also built this traditional Greenland style skin on frame kayak. So that's built out of Alaskan yellow cedar. And let me see if can I minimize this?
Hide floating meeting controls.
What was that?
Hide
Oh, sorry.
floating meeting controls.
Hide floating meeting. Yeah, there we go. So this was a high school project. I was reading books about indigenous craft. I was super excited about building one. So there's no nails, there's no glue in that entire boat. It's all pegs, like little wooden pegs and lashing. So you use like an artificial sinew and lash that. And then here we are as a family. We would take hay off of my parents' property because they had cows. And so we would do hay every summer. And that's what I did those were my first jobs, was pulling in hay from the field. My very first official job was working on an alpaca ranch. So like shearing alpacas. I have a lot of experience with alpacas. And then that's our beloved family dog who passed away in 2020, but he lived a very long life all through my high school years. His name's Tucker. So it was really a good life. I got exposed to like all kinds of practical skills. So as I was graduating high school, I thought, well, I want to be an engineer. But I still really wanted to just like build boats and like work on projects. So I applied to a small local university called St. Martin's University that was recommended to me by a neighbor. And so I accepted there and I went there right out of high school. And it was very close to where I grew up, so I could keep working on projects. And so my freshman year, or my sophomore year, I bought this derelict 16-foot fiberglass sailboat because I thought it would be great to restore a 16-foot fiberglass sailboat. I bought it for $240. You couldn't tow it home, so I loaded it onto my parents' flatbed trailer and then towed it home. And I bought it in North Seattle. I mean, it was like this whole ordeal. But while I was going to school for engineering, for mechanical engineering, I was restoring this boat. And it took an incredible amount of effort. I mean, so I cut into it and all the balsa core was rotted. So I had to replace the entire floor of the boat. I had to build a mold for the centerboard trunk. So I had to learn how to mold fiberglass, mold composites. And so that centerboard trunk was built new. I had to redo the entire floor, like everything is new. A new transom. I built the new mast and boom. I didn't have to make new sails. New paint, new rudder, new tiller, all new rigging. This is the dagger board that I had to build. Like it was just a crazy amount of effort. So, you buy a boat for $240 and then you put like $2,500 into it or something, and hours and hours and hours. And as I was doing this process, I thought, I've got to do this for a living. Like, I just love this. I love this, the ideas involved with this. I love the physics of sailing and the physics of boats. And, I'd kind of learned some of that in my sort of early mechanical engineering classes. So I thought there's got to be a way to do this for real. And so I started looking into it. I thought, is naval architecture, I didn't know about naval architecture, but I thought maybe it's like a legit career, So I started looking into that. And I found that there were basically 3 places to go: Michigan, Webb, and the University of New Orleans. And my immediate reaction was, I can't go to New Orleans. I mean, I didn't, it was such a culturally different place. I didn't expect to go there. But Webb was not going to give me any transfer credit. And I was like halfway done with the degree. And Michigan, honestly, was just too expensive for me for undergrad out of state. So I went to UNO, and it was one of the best decisions I ever made. I learned so much about life and so much about different people that I would say that was the most valuable aspect of it. I mean, you're living down in, South Louisiana. There's boats going through the river all the time. I like this photo. I took this of this tanker in the Mississippi. There's Mardi Gras World right there. And then in the distance is a oil refinery. I mean, and that's just the nature of that place is just so different from anything I'd grown up in. And that's my favorite dish from a restaurant in Marigny. If you need tips on New Orleans food, I got them. I have a spreadsheet of every place I went to. So, so yeah, it was a fantastic experience. I had my first job there. I was working in East New Orleans on the Industrial Canal at a boatyard. I thought, I'm gonna go like work in a boatyard. And if you know anything about East New Orleans, it's a pretty dangerous place. The Industrial Canal is a pretty rough place. And here I am, from Seattle, and I'm like 20, and I'm like, I'll just go work in this boatyard. And I met people from just every walk of life you could imagine, and shared stories with them, and learned about their experiences. And so it really opened my eyes. And that was an incredibly valuable time in my life. But I did learn a little bit about boats. I was involved in the sailing club, so we got to sail on Lake Pontchartrain, which is a very shallow lake. So whenever the wind blows, it's really choppy. You get a lot of standing waves near the coastline. So we would sail these 420s out of Southern Yacht Club, out on the lake. This is my senior design project from when I graduated, and my 3 senior design partners were still in contact today. One works at Incat Crowther, he's a project manager there. One works at Austell down in Alabama, and the other works for a shipyard in Louisiana. I think it's Thomas E. Shipbuilding. And we designed a subsea rock installation vessel. Nobody had ever done it. It was a really unusual project. We based it on Great Lakes bulkers. So that was where I learned kind of about these self-unloading carriers and things. But the idea was basically to install rock over subsea pipelines and cables. While I was in school, I did 3 internships, one at Westport Shipyard in Washington State, where I got to work in the shipyard. I was in a full Tyvek suit with a grinder, and I was grinding fiberglass inside the first 38-meter hull that came out. I also worked in small parts and marine carpentry, and I did some design work as well. And then I interned at Gloston one summer, which was like a dream because it was back in Seattle. Gloston was always high on my list of companies I wanted to work for. And this was a fantastic internship. It really was. And then for about, or most of my junior year, I guess it was, I worked, while I was in school, I'd work, not a lot of hours a week, but some hours a week on St. Charles at Bennett Offshore. And Bill Bennett, I don't know if he's still alive, but he was instrumental in a lot of early offshore rig design. And so we did lift boat design. So I was like writing scripts to like calculate the penetration loads of spuds on lift boats. It was a really unusual experience because we're dealing with naval architecture, structures, stability, but then we're also dealing with sort of this like geology sort of stuff. We'd get like soil penetration tests. We'd have to use those to determine our preloading plan. So this was a great experience. So anyway, so I was, going along in school, and I thought, well, I always did really well in school, grades and stuff like that. So I thought, well, maybe I want to do graduate school in the future. So I thought, well, I'll do an honors thesis because then I'll at least have some experience, like more academically rigorous experience to potentially build some applications. And so I wrote this honors thesis about this quadratic, this like nonlinear strip theory. It was like a strip theory code coupled to a finite element solver. And I wrote most all of the code. There was a little bit in there that I used from somebody else. And the whole time I was doing the thesis, this was senior year, I'm thinking, man, I really want to do something more exciting, like something with like machine learning or something with like, more like seemingly new. Although the more you learn about machine learning, it's been around forever. But I was interested in controls, I was just like interested in all these other ideas. But my advisor, which is Brandon Taravella, he's like, no, these coupled problems are important. Like, keep doing this thesis. And so I did this thesis, and I graduated in 2017. And this is a chart of the oil prices so I started school in naval architecture right here. And I graduated right here. So what happened was I had a job lined up at Gloston, and that fell through because they don't normally bid. They're not really exposed to the oil market, but the downturn was so steep and prolonged that they were losing bids to other companies that wouldn't normally be in there, like where they're normally, their jobs that they're going for. So that fell through. I had an offer from Westport, but it was kind of lousy. I didn't want to do yachts. And I thought, well, if this is prolonged enough, right, the yacht market's going to fall apart too. And I couldn't go back to Bennett Offshore because the writing was on the wall for them. Like this prolonged downturn in the oil market, especially in South Louisiana, especially during that time, it had been boom years for multiple like years. And then all of a sudden everything just dried up. So I didn't go back there. So I thought, well, I've got this thesis. My advisor seems pretty excited about it. You know, anytime I talk to somebody about it, they seem excited about it. So I thought, well, I'm going to try to use it to my advantage. Maybe start a company or something, right? And I'm, you know, I don't know a lot. And I go to my advisor, I thought, what do you think about me like selling this code? And he said, well, it's gonna be hard to convince somebody, you're fresh out of UNO, you don't have any experience, and it'd be pretty hard to convince somebody that they should hire you to do an analysis job. He said, what if you sent it to a company to see if they were interested in it? Potentially you could go work for them and, you know, develop similar ideas. Oh, and one other thing about this thesis. So before I started this, there was a professor, not my advisor, who I went to. I was very excited about it, about this idea of like sharing it with a company. And he told me flat out in his office, most theses are a failure. I wouldn't even try. And interestingly enough, that's the only thing I remember from that professor. So anyway, so I sent it to two companies, DRS, which is in Maryland, and Creative Systems, which does GHS in Washington. And I got an email back from Bill Pleiss, who started GHS. And he said, hey, can you come to our office? You know, and I'm like 3 weeks from graduating at this point, no job. And I'm like, yeah, like I'll come. And they sent me a copy of, at that time, it was the draft guidelines for the IMO second generation intact stability criteria, which is like a brand new criteria. It deals with like a lot of dynamic scenarios. And they said, they sent that before the interview and they said, read this. And they also ended the email with, do you think you could write software to address these guidelines? And I'm, again, like, don't have a lot of experience. I have my thesis behind me. I thought, well, there's only one right answer. Sure. Like I read through it, I was like, yeah. I mean, I didn't really know all the details, but I was like, I can't say no. So I go to the office and we have an interview. I mean, I had graduated. I went back to Washington, still don't have a job. Go to the office, we interview, and Bill Pleiss, he's right here on the left. He gives me an offer like later that day. And I'm like, all right, I guess I'm working for GHS. So I started work there in the summer of 2017 after I graduated. And he told me he wanted me to write a seakeeping code that was built into GHS, and he wanted it ready by January of 2018. So it's like 7 months, I'm fresh out of school. I spent so much time learning how to write Modula 2 code. I spent so much time reading PNA Volume 3. I mean, I've read Bob Beck's like writing over and over and over and over and over. Professor Troche, you know, there's all these papers from Michigan that at the time I'm reading, I'm learning, and you know, I got to implement it. It was an incredibly stressful period of time. I was working crazy hours. I was living by myself, fortunately, because no one would put up with that. But by the January of 2018, we released the seakeeping module for GHS, and I had written everything in it. I mean, I wrote my own panel code, so the potential flow code in that, like I wrote all of that. I mean, it was a crazy experience. I remember like it was hours before release and I'm like still finding bugs and like telling Steve like, hey, can you like put this in to ship the code with this? And yeah, it was stressful. It was released to some fanfare because, you know, while it's a linear code, it's still not like that groundbreaking really. But a lot of people around the world were excited about it. And I wrote this user manual, which was like a technical user manual. So it has all the theory. And Yeah, I mean, it basically took me after that initial release period, like another year and a half really to perfect it. But we'll get into that in a second. So once Seakeeping was released and I was like, I can like kind of move to a more normal life. I was living in this little village, Port Townsend, on the Olympic Peninsula of Washington. It's only a 9,000 person town. It's right next to Olympic National Park. There's nobody out there. So I like every weekend, I'm like out in the woods backpacking, or like this was a terrifying experience. I honestly didn't think we were going to make it through this. We were out like trying to climb a mountain and then the weather changed and we're like not in a good place. So there were good days and there were bad days. But Port Townsend's known to be, it's a wooden boat town. Like there's Mystic Seaport, Connecticut. There's Port Townsend, Washington. So I'm like with my people, right? Like all these people building wooden boats, they're storing wooden boats. Like it was a really cool place to be for a period of time. But, coming into 2020, I had developed tons of features for GHS. I had finally done the dynamic stability. So we were one of I think we were the first software program in the world to have a commercially viable solution for level 1 and level 2 of the IMO second generation intact stability criteria. And I published a paper with some senior engineers from ABS about this project because we did this in conjunction with ABS and we kind of did it for ABS, but we validated it with ABS. But there was tons of features, like you can run full Seakeeping analysis in that code. And I was communicating with customers, the Navy was using it. We were doing transportation jobs in the Mediterranean. We're doing transportation jobs in the Pacific and the Atlantic. We were doing quite a bit of salvage related work. So like the Golden Ray salvage, all of the Seakeeping for moving those modules was done with my code. Like there was so many jobs. And so I was freaked out at first because I was like, oh, these people are using my code, something's gonna go wrong. But the longer it went on, the more I felt comfortable and we just kept adding features. Washington State Ferries was a big early adopter and they used it for the fleet. But eventually I got this itch. I needed to do something different. And so I was down on the beach and I was actually sitting on this log. This is near Port Townsend, near where I was living. And I thought, do I want to do a PhD? I mean, I was in a great place. By that point, I'd actually become a partner in the company. So I had acquired some ownership in the company. And I thought, man, it's like, you feel like you have everything you want, but there's so much life ahead of you. Like I'm in my mid-20s and I'm thinking, if I don't do it now, I may never do it. And so I thought, well, I know Michigan uses GHS. I knew about Professor Mackey. I knew about all these prior Michigan professors because they had basically invented hydrodynamics. And I sent Professor Mackey and I sent Professor Collette an email. And I said, hey, I bought a plane ticket, homecoming weekend of 2019. I thought I'm gonna go and just meet and see what they say. And both Professor Collette and Professor Mackey were so, back up one, were so welcoming. When I came to the department, everyone was so welcoming. I got a tour of the MHL. They were incredibly welcoming. It was just like, again, it's like I had found my people. It was this incredibly good feeling. So I thought, well, I have to go to Michigan. I was looking at MIT too. But the difference, if you go to MIT and visit and you come to Michigan to visit, here, it's like people welcome you. And that was my impression. MIT, I didn't get that same impression. So I was like, Michigan's first choice. Absolutely. Like, I need to go to Michigan. And I got in, thankfully. Professor Mackey called me. I remember he called me on my personal cell. He's like, hey, we're going to extend an offer. And I'm like, oh, yes. Like, this is fantastic. But this was right in the beginning of COVID. And I thought, all right, I got to do, like, I've been hiking in the mountains. Here's Port Townsend. Here's the Olympic National Park. I've been hiking in the mountains a ton. I thought I better do one last big trip because if I don't do this, I'm not gonna have the opportunity to do it while I'm a PhD student. So I went out on my own and I hiked across the entire national park. And it was one of the coolest things I have ever done. It was absolutely incredible. It was 10 days. It was about 15 miles a day. It was a total of 150 miles. I think the vertical gain was like 28,000 feet or something. And I mean, I was out in the middle of the absolute wilderness with views like that. And this was up at the glacier at the very end, so near Mount Olympus. I mean, it was an incredible, incredible experience. And I journaled the whole thing, so I have it documented. Yeah, it was so cool. So like, this is my path to Michigan right here. When I went in, I wasn't a Michigan student. When I came out, I was a Michigan student. So I did that. And then I came to Michigan. This is my most boring slide. Not because I don't love it here. I actually am very blessed to be here. But the research and stuff, that's not the focus of this talk. But I'm working for Kevin Mackey. We're trying to merge physics and machine learning to advance nonlinear dynamics. We also have some hydrodynamic stuff in there. We're looking at these hybrid methods. But really, I do a lot of homework. I try to keep enough food in the fridge, and I try to get enough sleep. I think those three things take up a lot of time. But while I was here, I still kind of it was actually at SNAME 2019 in Tacoma. I was looking out at Mount Rainier, and I'd grown up with this mountain in my backyard. I was like, man, I got to climb that. So I trained for this, like an incredible amount of time. I had to take like ice climbing classes. I had to take all these climbing safety classes. I mean, it was an immense amount of preparation. But on July 14th of 2021, so last summer, we summited. And this is me with the Michigan flag on the top. So we brought the Michigan flag to the top, and we made it down safely. This is our descent. We're above the clouds. That's the route we took up. It's the Couts Glacier route, so it's an ice climb. So we had to climb the upper pitch of the Couts Glacier, which is just insane. Like the views, I've got tons of photos. The views, the physical exertion, the mental exertion. I mean, it's like nothing I've ever experienced. Here we are at like 3 a.m. belaying down a rock face above like a cliff. You know, it's just like, what is going on? I survived, thankfully. But it was a cool thing to do, and to be on top of that mountain that I'd seen my whole childhood was just like, whoa. So anyway, so the things I've learned, if an opportunity arises, you definitely take it. That's always true. I think some discomfort is a good thing. I've read a number of like philosophical writings about that. And if you're too comfortable, it doesn't push you. So like you want to get out of your comfort zone, you take a harder class, right? And you're like, maybe while you're in it, you're cursing it. But like once you're out, you're like, wow, I actually learned something. And then obviously for me, mountaineering was out of my comfort zone. But trust in your ability, you know, like that professor that told me all, you know, theses are a failure. And then my thesis is what allows me to develop a code that is now used commercially. You know, you got to trust yourself. I think we have so much potential. But sometimes if you're around the wrong people, it kind of holds you back. I think listening and being open-minded are so important. I mean, I went to New Orleans when I was relatively young, and thankfully I went with an open mind. And what I learned from other people and the way they live was just cemented in my kind of worldview that maintaining an open mind is absolutely critical. It really is. This one is a little funny. Never be intimidated by somebody with a fancy title. Also, never be impressed. I think titles are great. Like we all want to be successful. We all want to go on and do things. But titles are not us, right? So if somebody, you know, we're all people, and I think somebody who's been very successful, you know, if you approach them as a person and you talk to them as a person, you can connect with them more. So I feel we need to make titles kind of less of a focus in society. I mean, that gets into some weird views that I have, but that's something I believe in. Old and new can coexist, and the best solutions take a little of both. That's something I really believe in. I think in research that's true. I think there's often a misconception that, oh, it's new, so it's better. That's not always true. And there's often a misconception that, oh, it's old, so it's not good. You know, I think there's a lot of really amazing stuff that's been already done. We don't give it a chance because it's been around for like 50 years. So that's something I've learned. Even the most complex ideas can appear simple if viewed from the right perspective. I think that's very true, especially of technical things. This is related to my kayak. If my parents had bought me that sea kayak, I don't know if I would be here. I don't know if I would be doing naval architecture, because that needing to build that boat to satisfy my desire to go kayaking basically launched me into a career trajectory unknowingly. Seek out people that make you better, do things you enjoy, and mountains are dangerous. I'm not planning to do much more climbing. I had a couple bad experiences. I did have a fall at one point, and I've had a couple experiences that I'm very lucky to have gotten out of. It wasn't on Mount Rainier, but it was on some other mountains. So with that, I'll ask if you have any questions. Yeah.
On your family farm that you grew up on, was there water on the property?
There was a pond.
A pond?
Yeah.
Enough for you to test your boats?
It was smaller than this room,
Okay.
but it was big enough to test a boat.
And that first boat you built, you didn't have any help from adults? You did all that?
I did all that on my own.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. It was, I don't know. I was an industrious little kid, I guess. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And somebody who's been part way up Mount Rainier. Did you have any troubles with altitude sickness?
I did over 13,000 feet. I felt it like deep in my core. And I had to sit down. I had to take some time to, I got out over 13,000 feet. I was moving slow. I was moving really slow.
You
Yeah.
got less than half an atmosphere up there, so it's like, it's 2 breaths for.
Right. Right. It was a strange experience because I'd never been that high up before. I'd been at 12,000 feet. But for me, it set in at 13,000. And I mean, we were moving slow. We were breathing hard. I mean, you can't really, I wasn't like losing my mind or anything, but you definitely feel slower, like your thinking process. It was a really unusual feeling. Yeah, I don't recommend it. But it's cool to do if you're really motivated. It is cool to experience. So, yeah. Yeah.
Any thoughts on what you want to do once you get your PhD?
I have a lot of thoughts on that. I mean, I obviously could go back to GHS, and I still have ties there, although I'm on academic leave basically. So I really would love to start my own business still. Like, I think that would be an amazing thing to do. And I could see doing something in that realm. But I'll definitely stay sort of in the software analytical sort of simulation side of things. And I'd like to maintain a connection to the naval architecture community. So that's not like a good answer, but somewhere in that realm. I'm not really ruling out any possibilities, but I've had some interest from different places. So there'll be some decisions to make in the future. Yeah. All righty. Thank you. Yeah.